Greetings and greetings again, brethren. So this is the third reflection video that I'm doing, and I'm reflecting on a message that was shared by Brother Nader pertaining to the character of God message, and particularly where we believe that God is not violent and he does not kill. And as always, we believe that there could be more self-critical reflection among us as Christians in general and Adventists in particular, to objectively review and reflect on some of the messages that we teach, to objectively measure the consistency of them and look at whether they are making real sense. So in this particular video and all the series that we're doing, and many other videos that we do to share the word of God, we try to offer some alternative thinking or alternative approach, alternative interpretation of the Bible, so that the brethren can reflect for themselves and convince themselves which is the best way to look at things. In this particular video, continuing with the case of the sovereignty of God and looking into how that plays around within the life of a sinner. So in the second video, which is actually part 2a, dealing with the sovereignty of God, I made a point there that light and darkness uncompromisingly don't ever mix. And therefore, God cannot be expected to use the principles or ideas or thought processes that originate from the devil, from outside of God. So God is not the author of death and violence. Therefore, he cannot use death and violence, cannot execute death and violence by himself. This is a summary, so in case you have a different view, I would urge you to go back to that video and look at it more carefully. I'll be making some of those same points even in this video again. The other point that I made was that the commandments of God, the 10 commandments, the moral code, prohibit that which is not of God, and therefore cannot be found in God's character and cannot be done by God, because it is not in his character. God does not do things that are out of his character. Okay. Because then if he did something that's out of his character, then that becomes his character. Okay. You cannot do something that's out of your character and do it consistently and still argue that it's not your character. It doesn't work that way. It will not be acceptable even in a human court of law. The third point that I made was that yes, God can do whatever he likes, but again, in the moral code, he has given us what he likes, so we know what he likes and what he doesn't like. And the moral commandments, as we know them, makes it clear what he likes and what he does not like. So yes, we know what he likes, we know what he does not like, and therefore we know what he does and we know what he does not do. Killing is not one of those things which he does not like. So killing is one of those things that he does not like, and therefore it is one of those things that he does not do, together with lying and everything else that you guys already know. So that's the summary of it. I'm going to build on some of these points again in this video, and I hope that will be a blessing to you. Now, this point comes from the previous video as well, and it is about, based on John 8 verse 44, which tells us a very interesting principle that the sons do what their father tells them, or they learn from their father. That's what makes them the sons. This is what Christ himself preached. And in addition to that, he also preached in John 5:19 that, he everything that he did, he also learned from his father. He said, I do nothing of myself. What I see the Father do, that's what I do, which means what Christ did in those 3.5 years that we see in the Gospels is exactly what the Father does. It is also exactly the same thing that you'll find in the Old Testament. If you look at the Old Testament from the perspective of the New Testament. So, if that is so, if it is true that the devil is the murderer from the beginning. He is the author of murder. He is the author of death. He is the author of sin, and he is the author of killing. If that is so, and it is so, then how can God use the same principles in his government? He cannot, because God cannot be learning from the devil, can he? Okay. Because if God did not originate death and sin, and it was originated by the devil, and then God afterwards takes that and uses it himself, then that means he's learned from the devil, he's copied from the devil, and that is not going to happen. It cannot happen. So the logical basis that says God has the right to kill because it is his own life, I think it ignores the very important point that God himself cannot carry out the commandments or the lessons that derive from the authorship of the devil. And that is a very important point. That's more fundamental a point to the subjects that we're discussing about. So basically, a son follows the father, imitates the father, and God, being sovereign, cannot imitate anyone. He's independent. He's absolutely independent of anything that the devil can do and has ever done, according to what he has authored. Now, it has been said by many, and I think Brother Nader refers to that at some point in his video, that there's a difference between killing and murdering, and that the Bible teaches that God kills, but he does not murder. You know, in the commandments, when it says God, thou shalt not kill. Others versions would say God says, thou shalt not murder, because he does not murder, he kills. Therefore, these two are different. We are commanded not to murder, but I guess killing is acceptable, right? Is that what it means? That does it mean then that to us we are commanded not to murder, but we're allowed to kill, as God kills? When there's a good reason to kill, are we also supposed to kill? Is that what it means? Now, there are a lot of problems there, but just a quick one to make the point. The Bible does not distinguish between killing and murdering. In the Old Testament, there's no such distinction. The same word that is used for killing is the same word that is used for murder. The same word that is used for judicial killing, as you might want to call it, is also the same word that is used for murder. Those words are used interchangeably. And just one verse is enough to show that, but we can have more verses if you like. Numbers 35 verse 30 says, whoso killeth, and the word killeth there is word nakar, any person, which we are not worried about at the moment. But the next point is, the murderer, that's H7523, is the word ratzak, shall be put to death. So the murderer shall be ratzaked, if you want me to put it that way. So the one who has committed ratzak must also himself be ratzaked. That makes the word ratzak apply both to murder and to judicial killing. Okay. Then it goes on to say, by the mouth of witnesses, but one witness shall not testify against any person to cause him to die. Now the word die there is word muth, which is H4191. So again, that cause to die, which has been referred to as put to death, H753, is now being called H4191, which is muth. So these words are clearly being used interchangeably in this particular verse. So while in English we have that capacity to do so, you know, to separate death from killing, killing from murder, the Hebrew does not seem to be making that point. Okay, and therefore our point is our own, that we're building out of our own language, but from the language that was used to write the Bible, that is not possible. You cannot separate killing from murder using the Hebrew verbs that are used for that purpose. Now, here's another point that I wanted us to go to, and this is why I brought up again John chapter 8, verse 44 as a context to this verse, so that we can build into this. It says in 2 Corinthians 3, verse 18, but we all, with open face beholding as in a glass the glory of God, are changed into the same image from glory to glory, even as by the Spirit of the Lord. Now, notice some things here, some very important things in the highlighted words. we are changed into the same image. Okay, so we are to be like him. The point I've made before in previous videos, that God is the example, the highest example of virtuous moral conduct, and he presents himself as our example, so that when we behold him, when we look at him, we become like him. Okay, now notice another thing. We are beholding at his glory. I would propose that there's no glory in killing. Okay, there's no glory whatsoever. But here's the big problem. What are we being changed into when we are beholding a violent God? We're being changed into a violent humanity. This is, in my understanding, this is how humanity, which believes in God, that those most people, especially in previous years, most people believed in some form of God, but they believed in violent gods, and because of the violence of their gods, they themselves are violent. Because that's what they behold and that's what they see. Whether you see that God as Allah, or as some Hindu god, or some Buddhist god, or whatever kind of God, as long as you're looking at that God, you will become like him, because his teachings are him. So the problem now becomes, if God is our example, the image that we should be changed into, how can he tell us to do something that he himself is not? Because then what are we being changed into? Into what he has said, or into what he is? Because if he has said, thou shalt not kill, but he goes on to kill, then which one is our example? Is our example his words, or is our example his conduct? God teaches us, I believe, by both his word and by his example, by his moral conduct. He teaches us by that as well. And therefore, we learn from him in both ways. So because we learn from him in both ways, those two must always agree. His conduct and his words, they must always agree. And therefore, when he says, thou shalt not kill, we know for a fact that is also his conduct, that part, that not killing part. Now, Brother Nader, at 29 minutes 23 seconds, he says, I want us to think of this. When God leaves people or departs from people, and it's always Satan that does the killing, it really presents us with the very chilling prospects. Does that mean God is in partnership with Satan? Okay, I've paraphrased a little bit there at the end. And at 1 hour 17:51, he says, God's sovereignty is limited if he cannot withdraw the life that he gave, and he has to depend on circumstances or on Satan to do it for him. That's the limitation of God's sovereignty. It's his life. He is the ultimate authority in the universe, and the buck stops with him. Now, the idea that's coming here is very simple, in that if something that is done by the devil is said to also be done by God, then God and the devil are in partnership. This is the argument that's coming here. Okay, that if we say that it's not God who actually kills, it's the devil who kills, it's sin that kills, which in this case, Brother Nader seems to be referring to as circumstances. It's sin that kills, it's the devil that kills. Then we are making God and the devil in partnership. Now, I dealt with the issue of that partnership before in the previous video. You can go and listen to that. But now I want to deal with this specific contradiction, or self-defeating contradiction, in this argument. The problem with this argument is that the Bible itself gives us examples, or let me say, instances where the devil is said to have done that which God has done. So if our thinking is that if the devil does what God is said to have done, then that means they're in partnership. Then how do we deal with these verses? We have two verses to think about. 2 Samuel 24:1, which says, I'm paraphrasing, God was angry with Israel, and he moved David to number Israel. Now, if you go to 1 Chronicles 21, verse 1, it then says, on the same event, on the same person, in that very same instance, Satan is the one who stood up against Israel, and he provoked David to number Israel. So who did what? Does that make God and Satan working together now that Satan is doing what God has done according to these two verses? If we equate them, if we make them superimpose each other, that's what they seem to suggest, exactly that. So Brother Nada has to, I don't know how he's going to respond to that, but I would love to hear him respond to how is it that these two verses are giving the exact same act, the exact same decision is being given to both the devil and our God at the same time. If that's what makes the partnership with God, between God and the devil, then what is this? How do we explain this? These are the things we're grappling with. Here's another one. Exodus 12, verse 23. For the Lord will pass through to smite the Egyptians. So, I'll pause there. So, who is smiting? It's the Lord who is smiting the Egyptians. But now listen what it says further. And when he sees the blood upon the lintel, on the two side posts, the Lord will pass over the door. So here's what the remainder of this verse is saying. It is saying that in this smiting of Egyptians, God comes to the door, he looks at the door, he sees that there's blood on the door, and what does he do? He passes over. How is he smitten the Egyptians? It tells you next verse says, he will not suffer the destroyer to come into your houses to smite you. So it is somebody called the destroyer who is coming into the house to smite. And that smiting is the Lord who is smiting. But who is the destroyer? Is God the destroyer? It can't be, because we cannot say God is letting himself, he is passing over when he sees the blood, but at the same time he's not letting himself, go into to destroy. So who is the destroyer? The destroyer is the devil. We know that. We don't have to labor that point. But notice that both of them, the Lord and the destroyer, will smite. So the destroyer, who is the devil, is doing that which God wants to do. In other words, God is letting the destroyer destroy on his behalf. So does that mean they're in partnership? According to the logic that is given in the quotation that I gave from Brother Nader, because that's what it would mean, right? But that's not how I understand it. I'll explain how I understand it a little later. So Brother Nader's reasoning seems to fall into some problems here, because God seems to have let the devil withdraw life from the Egyptians on behalf of God, which is exactly what we're trying to battle with. Now, I want to mention a point that I mentioned in the first video again. I have absolute respect for Brother Nada, and I'm pretty sure he knows that. Benefited a lot from his teachings, and as I said in the first video, I so totally believes that the Father has used him specifically on the message of the identity of God, the non-Trinitarian message, and he has done some marvelous work, in particular on that one, but also in other areas. And I mentioned that because that's the one that I benefited from a lot. So I'm not doing this in order to expose him or to make an argument, but I'm just saying maybe this is something that him and others would need to reflect, and we need to discuss a little bit more in this same spirit. Okay, we're not arguing, we're not trying to destroy each other. We are not destroyers, right? The destroyer is someone else. We're just trying to share different viewpoints in that Christian environment, as we record, as has been recorded in the Bible also, that there were such discussions on theological and doctrinal issues. All right. So, like I said, I'll deal with the issue of how to deal with all this in a different way, maybe not in a different video, because I just want to present that point, the logical aspect of it. That there's a logical problem when we think that when God lets Satan do something for him, it becomes a partnership between God and Satan. It does not mean that at all. Otherwise, we will have a lot of problems with the Bible. So, coming back to that point, which says, where I quoted Brother Nada saying that if God lets the devil destroy, then the devil is destroying for God or on behalf of God. I'm paraphrasing. I think there are issues with that kind of thinking, and the issues are what I'm going to describe now. I don't believe there was ever a time, and there can ever be a time, when God wants to destroy the sinner, or is intending to destroy the sinner, or has ever planned to destroy the sinner. And we say this all the time among ourselves as Christians. We always say God loves the sinner, but he hates sin. So why does he hate sin? Because it is sin that destroys the sinner, not God. God never wants to destroy the sinner. He wants to destroy the sin. And the sin itself is the one that destroys the sinner, and it's one that has marred all of God's creation. So it is that sin that God wants to eliminate. Therefore, if we understand that, then we know that whenever sin, death, or Satan destroys anyone or anything, they're never doing it on behalf of God. It's never done on behalf of God. Therefore, it cannot be said that God has let the devil do it for him. Whenever death and sin and Satan destroy anything, they're doing it for themselves, because God is not the destroyer of sinners. Okay, and I think I have a quote in the first video, I think, about this, which is a quote from the Great Controversy, where Ellen White makes the point that God is not the executor. It does not stand as the executioner, against for the sentence of sin on the sinner, but he lets the sinner be destroyed or destroy himself because of sin, because it is the sin which is going to destroy men, not God. So Brother Nader's point that letting the devil destroy would mean the devil is destroying on behalf of God assumes that God intends to destroy the sinner, and that assumption is incorrect from a biblical point of view. It is not correct. That's what I believe. I think this is something that you could reflect on. Is that assumption correct, that God wants to destroy the sinner and love the sinner at the same time? Okay. Now that brings us to the point that how does God leave a sinner? If we are saying that the devil will destroy a sinner when God leaves the sinner, when God removes his protection from the sinner, then how does that happen? How does that play out? Because the manner in which, or the manner by which that plays out, either implicates or resolves God from the act of destroying the sinner. So that's the thing that we want to look into next. So again, how does God leave the sinner? What happens when your cup is full? When your cup is full, does God exercise his sovereign right to leave you, or do you exercise your free will to leave God? Which one happens, or does it mean both happen? I've come up with 3 possible scenarios of how that situation can act out, and you could be having other scenarios, but looking at these 3, the first one, does God leave the sinner in this way, where he says, phew, finally, good riddance? Does he leave the sinner like he's dumping garbage, like Azazel was left in the wilderness for the beast to devour, probably even tied to a tree to make sure that Azazel does not come back into the village, into the city? Is that how God leaves the sinner? Is he eliminating the sinner from himself when he leaves the sinner? Or is it option B, that vindictive and vengeful departure of a spouse in a divorce situation, where they would say, you've hurt me for a long time, I've been putting up with your garbage, it's now over, I'm packing my bags, I'm leaving you, and I'm leaving you with nothing. I'm destroying you because you've hurt me so much. Is that how God leaves the sinner, in that vengeful anger? Is that what we learn from Christ's character, is how God leaves the sinner? Or is it option C, where the Father is saying continuously, unto the very, very end, unto the very point where the sinner is destroyed, God is still saying, please don't go, come back, I love you, please don't do this, it's not good for you. Can we apply the parable of the loving father, which some call the parable of the prodigal son, but I argue that the main actor in that parable is not the prodigal son, it's the father and his love. Can we apply that to how God leaves the sinner? Can we apply that to how God leaves a rebellious soul? Is that how it works? And I believe that's how it works. Okay. As that father of the prodigal son was expecting his son to come back, as that father of the prodigal son, I believe, must have sat down with his son before he left and said to him, "Why do you want to do this? This is not good for you. This will destroy you." And as that father, in all that happened, he had not a single sense of vengeful anger over the son. And as that father at no time executed any form of violence on the son, and yet the son is referred to as being dead, but now alive. As that son was spiritually dead without the father exercising violence on him, but on the basis of his own choice, that is the son, the prodigal son. That is how I believe the father leaves the sinner. But something happens, I believe, at that point, that when the father sat down the son and said, your choice is not right, it's going to kill you. As we see in Deuteronomy chapter 28 from verse 15 going downwards, when God lays out the consequences of rebellion to the children of Israel. And he says to them, if you do this, you're going to receive curses, you're going to be running away from your enemies, and you're going to receive pestilences and all those kind of things. When God laid those things out, Israel, it must have been interpreted as God indicating his direct choice and intention to execute that outcome, instead of as God pronouncing by way of warning what would result of Israel's own choice according to spiritual law, which says you reap what you sow. So the announcement, the warning, is interpreted as the intention, as the choice, as the desire of the father to execute violence and to execute the punishment in a vengeful fit of anger. And that's how I believe we have been deceived by the devil to see the Father in a different light. And I believe that this parable was given us to us to set us free, to set us into the correct frame of mind about how the Father non-violently executes justice. It is interesting in that parable of the loving Father that the Son was referred to as dead or killed, but now is alive again. Dead or killed by who? By the Father? No, he was never killed by the Father, but he was dead and killed by his own choice, by the consequences of his own choice, according to the law that says what you reap, you will sow. There was no compulsion whatsoever from the Father. And ironically, the very fact that the Father did not violently try to stop the prodigal son from leaving is actually the reason why, when you compare that to God, he is blamed as the one who is the cause of the death of those who die by rejecting him, by rebelling from him. Because then some will say, why didn't he stop the devil from destroying the son? So the father is implicated because he has done something according to his character, according to his holy, righteous character, by not using any force whatsoever. And by that not using any force whatsoever, as I showed in the second video, the previous video before this one, by that he's then blamed as being the one at which the buck stops, because he didn't do the violence that men expected him to do. And that's the sad part of this story. So my summary: it is inconsistent that God would teach us not to do what he does, because God is through and through our example of character in what he does. A son's practice is from his father, okay? And to do what somebody is authored, to do what someone has started, is to be a follower of that person. And therefore, God cannot do and cannot exercise that which the devil has started. Otherwise, lest God be a follower of the devil. God forbid. That's not possible. It cannot be. So if by beholding, the third point, if by beholding we are changed, then beholding an image of a violent God inevitably, naturally, without any doubt, will lead us to be as violent as he is. And this partly explains the violence that's been executed in Christianity, and not just in Christianity, but across all religions, because people look at a violent God, and the generations have become violent because of the God that they think that they're looking at, and they are changed to be like him because they're looking at him. The fourth point, God's sovereignty is not limited if he's not killing, because he never wanted to kill the sinner to start with. Okay, he never wanted to kill the sinner. It is the sin that he wants to remove, because it is the sin that kills and destroys his children. God himself always, as it says about Christ, he ever liveth, okay, for this purpose of our salvation. At no time does he live for the purpose of our destruction. We destroy ourselves. The parable, my fifth point, the parable of the prodigal son is a clear representation of how God leaves the sinner in a very literal and non-vindictive way, but with pain in his heart for a son who has rejected the father. That rejection, according to the parable, is the death, not any violence inflicted by a father. The father is always hoping for the son to return. He is always waiting, looking towards the road, towards the gate, looking down the road to see when the son is coming. And sometimes, unfortunately, the son does not come back because the son is dead, not because of the father. So, as eating the forbidden fruit, my sixth point, as eating the forbidden fruit was pronounced by God as death to Adam, yet not a death executed by God himself, so was leaving the father death to the prodigal son, yet not by the direct hand of the father. So with this parable, among other parables, and we're going to do that in the next few videos, we're going to use the parables to understand the Old Testament. But in this parable of the loving father, we can interpret differently many of the stories of the Old Testament which seem to reveal a violent God. The last point, the statement that his thoughts are not our thoughts and above our thoughts and our ways does not quite apply to the thought of killing if God killed, because there is nothing holy and lofty about the thought of killing someone for whatever reason, and even less so for a reason that he has wronged you or he has rebelled against you. Even most humans will struggle to kill their worst enemies face to face. But the devil has such thoughts all the time. He is the murderer, and he has been the murderer, was the murderer from the beginning, not the father. Now, as I did in the previous video, I will ask those who want to rely on the Bible alone. If they want, they can stop watching at this point. This is not the end of the video. I want to go into a few quotes from Ellen White so that we can see that she makes the exact same point, particularly that point that I made earlier, about how God leaves the sinner. That's what I want to get from her writings. So this one is from the Great Controversy. Please read with me very carefully. Their sufferings, that is the sufferings of Israel, are often represented as a punishment visited upon them by the direct decree of God. Let's stop there. Question: who represents the punishment on Israel as a direct decree from God? Who does that? Answer is the Bible itself. Okay. It's the Bible itself. You can read for yourself many places, but let's just read Deuteronomy chapter 28 from verse 15 going downwards. You will see that it tells you that God himself shall smite Israel with debauches of Egypt, with curses, with whatever. It says God will smite. So it is presented in the Bible as the direct decree of God. But listen to what Ellen White says next. It is thus that the great deceiver seeks to conceal his own work. So in that presentation, in that interpretation that God is the one who is directly decreeing the punishments on Israel, in that very decree, that is how the deceiver has deceived people and concealed his work, which means the work that is concealed there, the work of punishment is his work, because it has been concealed as a direct decree of God. Okay, I hope you understand. I hope that my interpretation there resonates with you. So the great deceiver has concealed his work, the work of destroying, the work of killing, as punishment of Israel. He has concealed that within an understanding that it is a direct decree of God, and that is decreed by the Bible itself, that it is a decree from God, that punishment. And as I say, so much for reading the Bible as it reads. Because if you read the Bible as it reads, you cannot come to this conclusion that Ellen White did. Those who say we read the Bible as it reads. Now, let me explain. Let me be clear here. Okay, you read the Bible as it reads, definitely, but that does not mean you read the Bible literally, every word literally. It doesn't mean that at all. Okay, it doesn't mean that at all, because Ellen White clearly did not do that here, because he says that representation of God as directly decreeing punishment is the deception of the devil, and yet the Bible tells us that exactly the Lord does that. It's a puzzling thing. Let me go on. The horrible, I'm reading highlighted words, the horrible cruelties enacted in the destruction of Jerusalem are a demonstration of Satan's vindictive power over those who yield to his control. In other words, that very thing that God is blamed, God is given as the one who has directly decreed the punishment. That is how the devil operates. That's what this verse is, that's this quote is saying to me. That's his way of operation. Okay, when one is given into his hands, he operates in such a way that what he does is concealed as if it has been done by God. And this demonstration goes all the way to the very destruction of men at the end. It looks like God has done it, but it is not. This is what I learned from this. So, just to remember, when God is said to smite, it means God has withdrawn his protection. But how does God withdraw his protection? We saw before how God withdraws his protection. By allowing man to do his own will, and by respecting man's free will, because man at a certain point makes it impossible for God to intervene, just as the prodigal son did. Okay, now here's the next paragraph of that same quote from the Great Controversy, 36.1. where she makes a statement that brings the point home, that sort of solidifies everything together. And she explains a concept which, understanding it from the Bible and then seeing it from her writings as well, has changed my life, has changed. And I would love to see, I would definitely love to see the Brethren reflect a little bit more on this. I'll read the highlighted words. You can pause the video and read the rest. But many people know this quote anyway, those who read Ellen White's writings. It says here, it is the restraining power of God that prevents mankind from passing fully under the control of Satan. Now, when I think of that, the picture that comes to my mind is the picture of a dam wall, right? A dam wall, it restrains the water above, behind it, right? And stops that water from rushing down the river and destroying whatever lies down there. Okay, and God, I see Him as that restraining power. Now, it comes a day and it comes a point when the water relentlessly applies pressure to a point where the dam wall cannot continue beyond a certain point. Comes a point where the dam wall is unable to continually resist the pressure from the water. That's how I could picture it. And at that point, the collapse of the dam wall can be blamed for having collapsed, but the real thing that has happened is that the water has become too much for the dam wall. Okay, and that's exactly how I see that. So God stands there as a restraining power to make sure that we don't fully pass under the control of the devil. But notice that we don't fully pass, but we are actually in some ways under the control of the devil anyway in this world, and therefore God is making sure that we don't pass completely under that control, so that dam wall could be totally breached. This is what I explained before when I talked about how when man leaves this God, it is thought of as God leaving man, and it is often reported that way. Now, let me go to the quote in red, which I think captures the whole point quite nicely. It says then, God does not stand towards the sinner as an executioner of the sentence against him. We know very well that there are certain things that God cannot do. There's a certain point where God cannot go. Okay, he cannot go beyond a certain point. And this is what happens. God himself is not the one who decrees that the sinner must die and executes that sinner must die. God announces to the sinner by way of warning, as he did in Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 15, reading downwards, to the children of Israel, and announced to them and pronounced to them what is going to happen to them if they did not obey God. And to them, as they interpreted it as God doing that to them, but he was warning them of what was to come if they did not listen to God. But God is not the executioner of the transgression that of the sentence against transgression to us. He allows us to reap what we sow, which is the natural law, which is also the spiritual law. It's a universal law. You sow, you reap. So whatever we've sown is what we're going to reap. The Spirit of God, I read on the next part. The Spirit of God persistently resisted, is at last withdrawn from the sinner, and then there is left no power to control evil passions of the soul, and no protection from the malice and enmity of the devil. So this is what happens. The withdrawal of the Spirit of God actually means we've come to a point where the Spirit cannot continue to hold on, because God at some point, he just has to accept, to respect your free will, and like the case of the prodigal son, allow you to go. I believe that in that parable of the prodigal son, given the desire that the father had to see his son back, I believe that before the son went, the son decided to go. I believe that the father had a talk with him and said, why do you want to do this? Why don't you stay? What's wrong? He tried to plead with him, and I believe that's what God does to us all the time. He's pleading with us. He's telling us what will happen. He's telling us what wrong will happen. And when he does that, we look at him and say, you are the one who wants to do this, as I've explained in the previous slide from the quote from Ellen White. So this is how I've come to understand, and this is why what I would like to present to the brethren to think about and maybe reflect on. So that's basically the final part that I wanted to present. So in the next video, I'm going to touch on, I'm still talking about sovereignty of God, but I'm going to touch on Adam's hidden sin, which is basically the whole inclination of humanity to blame God for what humanity has done, and it stretches a long way. I won't be able to cover all of that, but I'll begin to touch on some of the things. And if you're interested, there are more videos on our channel. Please feel free to get in touch with those, and maybe also communicate with us if you want to. At the beginning of this video, there's our email. You can use that to get in touch with us, and we can talk more in that Christian environment where we don't label each other with some labels such as blasphemer, heretic, or whatever, rebel, whatever else you want to say. But we just simply discuss and share ideas, and let each one of us reflect on what has been said according to the leading of the Spirit of God. May our Father richly bless you in the name of his only begotten Son. Thank you.